Hey guys, and welcome to the latest episode of What's in a Remake, the show where I take a look at remakes and remasters of games and compare them with their original releases. On today's episode, I'm going to be covering a set of games that are beloved by many, especially those that grew up with them. Today I'll be covering Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and its sequel Pro Skater 2, which were developed by Neversoft and published by Activision in 1999 and 2000 respectively. Then, I'll briefly mention the history of the Tony Hawk's franchise since those releases, as well as briefly cover the first full attempt at remaking the games with Tony Hawk Pro Skater HD, developed by Robomodo in 2012, before finally concluding the video with an in-depth look at the recently released Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2, developed by Vicarious Visions, the same developers behind the excellent Crash Insane Trilogy remakes, and how it brings the original two games back, both in terms of its overall quality, and what changes have been made to sections of the original for better or worse. The Tony Hawk series is quite beloved by many, due in part to its tight skateboarding gameplay, excellent selection of licensed music tracks, great level design, and its enjoyable and satisfying career mode progression. Suffice to say, most of the games in the series are excellently made arcadey skateboarding games that are not only great fun, but are also fun to look back on due to the music, art style and general attitude of the game feeling very much like a product of the times they were developed in. As such, it's probably fair to say that this will probably be quite a weighty video, as I'm taking a look at quite a few different games, but I'll do my best to keep each section relatively streamlined, yet still comprehensive and informative, to keep it within a reasonable length. So if I miss out on any important details regarding any of the games that would have been prevalent to mention, I apologise in advance. Also, due to the nebulous nature of the game's soundtracks being completely comprised of licensed music, I'll be using the Game Boy Advance versions of the soundtracks as backing music in this video, which should hopefully be unique enough to not get flagged for copyright, but we'll see. Anyway, without any further ado, let's get on with the video. Here's What's in a Remake, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2. Tony Hawk Pro Skater was developed by Neversoft and published by Activision in 1999 for PlayStation 1, with ports for the Nintendo 64, Game Boy Color, Dreamcast and N-Gage arriving later on. The game was received incredibly well both critically and commercially, with an aggregate score of 92 on Metacritic, based on 18 critic reviews for the original PlayStation version. The game focuses on performing various skateboarding tricks such as various grabs, flips and grinds in a sequence and landing combos to accrue points, as well as fill a special gauge which can be used to perform the character's unique special tricks that reward you with more points. The game's career mode has you going to various different levels to attempt to clear a set of objectives, usually involving getting over a certain amount of points, or collecting certain objects in a 2-minute time limit to obtain videotapes that will unlock more levels. These levels vary between free roam stages and downhill stages, with the first type being wide open areas that you can explore until the time runs out, whilst the downhill stages are linear levels that see the player descending for a fairly narrow area until they reach the end. Some levels in the career mode are slightly different, instead comprising of smaller skateboarding competition areas where you have to accrue as many points as possible whilst also ensuring you don't bail out too often in order to rank the highest in a competition and obtain a medal which you can use to, just like with the tapes, unlock more new levels. The game features 9 levels in total, with 4 free roam areas, warehouse, school, downtown and streets, with 2 downhill levels, mall and downhill jam. There are also free competition areas, skate park, Burnside and Roswell. All of these levels are pretty well designed, with excellent ramp and object placement making for great ways to pull off some sick trick combos, though admittedly some, in particular downhill jam, are pretty unforgiving when it comes to some of the tasks you need to complete. Visually, the levels are all unique enough in terms of theming that the fairly simple gameplay doesn't get stale the further you get into the game, though admittedly the levels themselves feel somewhat lacking in terms of object variety and unique location assets, at least compared to later games, and the use of colour, or lack thereof, tends to make some areas look a bit blander than others. That's not to say they're bad or anything, because for the most part they're great. It's just they're a bit lacking in some places that were improved on in later games. In terms of challenge, there isn't an adjustable difficulty option in the game, so whilst the opening levels are fairly easy to complete, the later levels get quite tricky due to some nasty objective placement, as the controls do admittedly feel a little imprecise in some places, especially during moments where the character's speed makes it difficult to complete certain objectives, and with the lack of many options with which to extend combos, such as manuals or reverts, which were added in future games, it's quite tricky to reach the point objectives in some of the later levels. The game has a sizable roster of characters, those being Tony Hawk, Bob Burnquist, Kareem Campbell, Rune Glifberg, Bucky Lasek, Chad Musker, Andrew Reynolds, Jeff Rowley, Alyssa Steamer, and Jamie Thomas. There are also two secret characters, those being Officer Dick, who can be unlocked by obtaining all tapes and gold medals with any skater in career mode, as well as Private Carrera, who is only playable by entering a cheat code which will replace Officer Dick in the character select with her. Characters differ in more than just their appearance, as each character has their own starting stats and unique tricks that make them all feel fairly unique to play, at least initially, despite the core gameplay loop being the same. There is also a multiplayer versus split screen mode, but I wasn't able to play it myself due to having no one to play it with, but from what I've seen of it, it has several different modes that are all pretty fun to play, such as Graffiti, where players compete to tag as many objects as they can in their colour, Trick Attack, where players compete to see who can achieve the highest score within a time limit, and finally Horse, where players take turns trying to beat each other's combo scores, with the loser being the one who fails enough times to accrue all the letters in the word horse. In terms of the soundtrack, it's pretty great and has a solid selection of about 11 licensed music tracks, including Superman by Goldfinger, that really gets you in the mood to skate. One of the things that is usually most beloved by fans of the series is the quality of its soundtrack, and it's quite easy to see why when listening to these tracks during the game. They really help to set the mood, and it's one of the reasons why a lot of the later games and remasters sometimes miss the mark to fans of the series. Overall, Pro Skater 1 is a very competent first game in the series that at the time was a fun and very enjoyable extreme sports game. And it's still quite good even today, despite it lacking several key gameplay refinements added in later installments that keep it from being an outright classic. It's a good first step to the franchise that helped to define the groundwork for the series in terms of gameplay, style and charm, but nothing more. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 was released a year later, again developed by Neversoft and published by Activision, and included several improvements to the core gameplay that made it a much more enjoyable game to play, such as the ability to perform manuals to chain tricks, as well as the added features of Create a Skater, where you can make your own skater, and the Park Editor that allows you to make your own levels using a range of preset objects. The game itself was released on a multitude of platforms, first being PlayStation 1, but then afterwards it was ported to Nintendo 64, Sega Dreamcast, Game Boy Advance, Mac, PC, and Game Boy Color, with a downscaled remake of the PC version later releasing on iOS mobile devices. There was also an enhanced port of the game developed in 2001 by Treyarch called Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2X, which was exclusive to the original Xbox and was only released in NTSC regions, never receiving a PAL or NTSC-J release. This version of the game is considered by many to be the quintessential version of the game, as it contains pretty much all of the content from both Pro Skater 1 and 2, with upgraded models and textures, as well as 5 new levels, those being Club, Construction Site, Skate Park, Subway, and Skylines. For the purposes of this video though, I played through the original PS1 version of Pro Skater 2, as it was the first version of the game released, though I will still be mentioning 2X later in this video when comparing it to the other attempts at remastering and remaking these games. Pro Skater 2 features a career mode similar to the first, though it differs somewhat, with each level now containing 10 objectives to complete, as opposed from the 5 in the original. These tasks range from completing score objectives, completing tricks in certain places, collecting all of the skate letters or sets of objects, as well as finding the hidden tape found in each level. Unlike in the original, where completing objectives awards you with tapes that will unlock new levels, this time each objective completed awards your character with money, which can be used to purchase new boards, stat upgrades and new tricks, as well as unlock new levels after reaching a cumulative total amount of money collected. One gameplay feature that was added in this game that I like is the ability to customize a skater's loadout in terms of what tricks they can pull off and what button presses you need to do in order to complete them. It's a neat feature, especially with the addition of Create a Skater, that helps to allow the player to play the game however they want, without feeling like they're being restricted by their trick loadout. On the topic of Create a Skater, that mode allows you to create your own skater from a very limited selection of face, body and leg options. The lack of options is for the most part fine due to the limited graphical capabilities of the PS1 making face textures for the most part look like mush, but it's way too limited to be completely enjoyable. It's a neat addition, but it's bare bones and very lacking. In terms of level types, gone are the downhill levels from Pro Skater 1, instead the game focuses only on free roaming competition levels, which was a little disappointing for me personally, as even though they were a bit of a pain in terms of difficulty, the downhill levels in the first game were a nice change of pace from the rest of the levels and varied things up nicely. On the plus side though, I did think the free roam levels in Pro Skater 2 were overall a bit more enjoyable than the ones in the previous game. Same with the competition stages for the most part, as there's a lot more variety to the objects and their placement as well as the level unique assets. For example, the bull in the bull ring, or the helicopter in the hangar. The game features a total of 10 levels, one more than the first game had, though half of them are the smaller competition levels compared to the 3 the first game had. They are Hangar, School 2, Marseille, New York City, Venice, Skate Street, Philadelphia, Bull Ring, Chopper Drop, and finally Skate Heaven. Visually the levels are all fairly visually unique. Feel a bit too similar to levels from the first game in terms of design, which is a little underwhelming. In particular, New York City, Skate Street and Philadelphia feel visually similar to Pro Skater 1's downtown, skate park and streets, at least to me. And when playing both games back to back for the purposes of this video, I will admit I got a little burnt out from the similar aesthetical design between both games. New to Pro Skater 2 is the ability to create your own skate parks, from a range of different options including ramps, half pipes, quarter pipes, rails, as well as various decoration options. Again, like with Create a Skater, it's a neat feature that allows for some really cool custom tracks, but at the same time is lacking somewhat in object variety, and most custom parks end up looking very similar because of that. For the most part I enjoyed the gameplay of Pro Skater 2 a lot more than 1, due to the new additions such as manuals and stance switching, as well as the larger variety of tricks that can be performed. Though from what I've played, those are the only real advancements made. They've taken the Pro Skater 1 gameplay and fleshed it out more and refined it in a way that makes for more opportunities to perform cool combos, while still retaining the overall skill required to pull them off well. In terms of playable characters, all of the characters, including the secret ones from the first game, return, with Private Carrera even getting her own dedicated slot on the roster this time, though in 2X she's completely replaced with a generic skater named Trixie. The game also includes 3 more pro skaters, Steve Caballero, Eric Costin and Rodney Mullen, As mentioned earlier, you can also create a skater and play through the career mode as them if you so choose. The game also features one new secret character, the Marvel Comics superhero Spider-Man, who can be unlocked by 100% completing the career mode as a created skater, which is a pretty awesome reward for such a challenging task, especially since he has some cool unique tricks that make use of his web-slinging abilities. In terms of its soundtrack, the game features about 15 songs and is altogether pretty damn great, with such hits as Guerrilla Radio by Rage Against the Machine, Blood Brothers by Papa Roach, and When Worlds Collide by Powerman 5000 standing out as my personal favourites. It's just a really good tracklist to skateboard around the areas with, and really helps to boost one's enjoyment with the game as a whole. Overall, Pro Skater 2 definitely feels like a more solid overall game than the first, with more to do with the inclusion of the character creator and park editor, even if they do feel like bare-bone features, as well as a mostly more interesting level selection than its predecessor. The soundtrack as well is superior to Pro Skater 1, and the larger career mode and new gameplay enhancements add a lot more variety that will have players constantly coming back for more. Admittedly, it does feel like when it comes to the Pro Skater series, 1 and 2 have definitely aged the worst in terms of both gameplay and aesthetical design, as they were the first two games, with future entries having even more fleshed out and developed gameplay. But they still are both solid games, and it's easy to see just why they are so memorable and beloved by many. After Pro Skater 2, the series continued its trend of releasing a new entry yearly, with 2001 seeing the release of Pro Skater 3 and 2002 with Pro Skater 4, both being received very well critically and commercially, with new additions and improvements to the gameplay mechanics helping to keep the series fresh and exciting, despite the yearly release schedule. After that though, the Pro Skater series took a fairly long hiatus, with Neversoft instead moving on to developing the Tony Hawk Underground series, which changed up the career format drastically, instead allowing you to free roam around areas without a time limit, and making the objectives quest-based instead of general objectives, with again several new additions and improvements to the core gameplay to help refine it further. After Underground 1 and 2, Neversoft then attempted something quite challenging for the next installment, American Wasteland, where the career mode took place in one large area that connected all the levels in the game together without a load screen, though admittedly it managed this by making large, fairly empty, bland hallways between areas to give the game time to load the new areas in, which arguably in my opinion is worse than just having the levels separated by a load screen. Tony Hawk Underground 1 and 2 and American Wasteland all included several remade versions of levels from the Pro Skater series as unlockable classic stages. They were Hangar, School 2 and Venice from Pro Skater 2 and Underground, Underground 2 had School and Downhill Jam from Pro Skater, Philadelphia from Pro Skater 2, and LA Canada and Airport from Pro Skater 3. Finally, American Wasteland had Downtown Minneapolis, The Mall, and Chicago from Pro Skater, and Marseille from Pro Skater 2. The reason I'm mentioning this will become relevant when I talk about the first attempt at making a HD remake of the Pro Skater games later in this video. After that, Neversoft moved on to the next generation of consoles with Tony Hawk Project 8, a solid and enjoyable game with a staggering amount of playable characters and some really great level design that sadly released just as series fatigue was setting in and a lot of people started dropping off the franchise. As such, it didn't receive quite the amount of attention it probably should have given its quality. Personally, this was the Tony Hawk game I grew up with, and I played it for hours and hours on end, though admittedly at the time it was the only Tony Hawk game I played, so I had nothing to really compare it to, but I still enjoyed it regardless. The next game, Proving Ground, turned out to be Neversoft's final Tony Hawk game, and was at the time the worst received, despite being mostly solid, due in part to the bland and kinda dull level design, as well as just because the Tony Hawk series at that point had been run into the ground because of all the yearly releases, and skateboarding had long since lost most of its popularity at that point. Afterwards is what most people tend to call the dark ages of Tony Hawk games, with developer Robomodo taking charge of developing games in the series, such as 2009's Tony Hawk Ride and 2010's Tony Hawk Shred, two games that attempted to cash in on the plastic peripheral craze at the time by utilising an incredibly awful and unresponsive skateboard controller to control in-game actions, and due to that they were absolutely terrible games to play. Robomodo also developed Tony Hawk Pro Skater HD, which I'll be talking about in a little bit, which was a remake of some of the levels from Pro Skater 1, 2 and 3, but is no longer available for purchase due to it being a digital-only title that was removed from all digital stores due to licensing issues. This remake was also met with mediocrity when it released, with critics praising the updated visuals but criticising the gameplay, music selection, and the amount of bugs and issues the game had. The final game Robomodo developed before becoming defunct was the atrociously bad Tony Hawk Pro Skater 5, which was released in 2015 for PlayStation 4, Xbox One, PS3 and Xbox 360. It was for all intents and purposes a broken shell of a game that used the Pro Skater name to try and cash in on the series' legacy and popularity. The game took several large patches after release just to be in a playable and presentable state, and basically burnt whatever fan support the franchise had remaining after the awful Ride and Shred, and it basically killed the entire series. Thankfully though, in early 2020 it was announced that Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2 would be getting a full remake, this time developed by Vicarious Visions, the developers of the incredibly good Crash Insane Trilogy remake collection, as well as the developers behind the handheld ports of Tony Hawk games, all the way from Pro Skater 2 until Proving Ground, all of which were received incredibly well critically. As such, a lot of people were cautiously optimistic that this remake, that was purported to remake all of the levels from the original two games, unlike the previous HD remake that only remade a couple of levels, would finally restore some of the prestige and quality back into the series. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2 finally released on 4th of September to critical success, with most critics praising it for breathing new life into the franchise with its incredibly good recreations of classic Pro Skater levels, as well as for refining the gameplay by including gameplay features that were not originally present in Pro Skater 1 and 2, such as reverts and acid drops. Before I move on to the Pro Skater 1 and 2 remake itself in more detail, I feel it's probably best to discuss the previous attempt Activision had with remastering the game, with the release of 2012's Tony Hawk Pro Skater HD, developed by Robomodo, the studio behind pretty much all of the worst Tony Hawk games, including such gems as Pro Skater 5, Ride, and Shred. The game itself is no longer available to buy, as it was a digital release on PC, PS3 and Xbox 360 that has since been removed from all digital storefronts, due presumably because of Activision's license to the Tony Hawk franchise running out at the time. So I'll mostly be using footage taken from trailers for the game, as I don't own it myself and I don't really want to faff around with dubious key sellers trying to find a copy of a game I won't play after I've finished this video. The game was an amalgamation of several levels from Pro Skater 1 and 2, with tracks from Pro Skater 3 being added later on as DLC, so it feels a bit more like a best hits compilation rather than a full remaster, and even then when you frame it like that, it's kind of lacking some of the better levels from those games. The game is for the most part just a passable remaster of the original games, with decent rehauled visuals breathing fresh life into some of the areas, yet at the cost of the game's stability and gameplay, as glitches were very common and the game's physics just don't feel nearly as good as the originals. The soundtrack is also pretty lacking, only containing 7 of the songs from Pro Skater 1 and 2, with a bunch of newer replacement tracks that, whilst decent, don't really have the same feel as the original game's music tracks, which is a real shame. The character roster is fairly average, with only a couple of the Pro Skaters from 1 and 2 returning, with a host of newer modern Pro Skaters taking up most of the roster. Secret unlockable characters consisted of Officer Dick, as expected, as well as Ollie the Magic Bum, Roberta the Robomodo mascot, and a PlayStation 1 style version of Tony Hawk. In terms of levels, there were 7 in the base game: Warehouse, School 2, Hangar, Mall, Venice, Downhill Jam and Marseille, with an additional 3 DLC levels from Pro Skater 3 added at a later date: Canada, Airport and Los Angeles. What's interesting to note about the levels chosen for this game is that all of them were remade previously as classic levels in Underground 1, 2 and American Wasteland, as I mentioned earlier. So even though it was the first time these tracks were available in high definition, it wasn't the first time they'd seen a graphical enhancement, and that combined with the mediocre gameplay made the remaster feel very much more like a rushed cash grab than a faithful and content-packed remake, especially when you consider that before the DLC that added a couple of Pro Skater 3 tracks was released, the game had the smallest level selection out of any of the mainline Tony Hawk games. In summary, Pro Skater HD is kinda just mediocre. It's not awful and it's still fairly enjoyable to play, but in many ways, it's a lot worse than just playing the original versions of the game, despite the updated graphical fidelity. The gameplay itself is worse, the music selection just doesn't come close to matching the feel of the originals and kinda misses the mark when it comes to getting you pumped up to skate, and it just lacks a lot that a remaster needs to be a justifiable purchase. When a remake is outshined by its original release in almost every way aside from visuals, it really does beg the question on whether the remake has any point of existing to begin with. The same cannot be said, however, for the latest attempt at remaking the first 2 Tony Hawk games, which goes above and beyond to take almost everything from the originals, as well as gameplay and graphical enhancements made over the past 20 years, and cram it all into one incredibly faithful remake. Where do I begin with Pro Skater 1 and 2? After an awesome intro video that introduces you to all of the old and new pro skaters, complete with live action footage of them pulling off some cool tricks, you're met with an awesome title screen as the game's stellar soundtrack gets you amped up to skate. Though after some depressingly Activision privacy policy contracts that you have to agree to, you get asked if you wish to try the tutorial, which gets you up to speed with everything you need to know to pull off radical tricks and smooth moves. After that, you're let loose on the game and man, the amount of content in the game is quite staggering. You've got the standard career modes present in the original games, though the levels from Pro Skater 1 have had their list of objectives expanded to 10 objectives, similar to Pro Skater 2's objective amount, which is both nice in the sense that it adds meaningful longevity to the game, but also a pain because it means I've actually got to be good at the game to complete it all. Like a lot of modern video games, completing in-game objectives and challenges will net you experience points with which you can level up your global profile rank, as well as give you cash to purchase customization items from the in-game skate shop. From what I've seen, leveling your profile pretty much only really amounts to unlocking new stuff for purchase in the skate shop, but it's good at setting a global objective for the player to achieve as they progress through the game. The in-game challenges and missions themselves involve completing specific tasks over the course of your playthrough, ranging from doing a certain amount of kickflips, heel flips and grabs over the course of your global playtime, to character-specific ones like performing a combo within a set amount of specific tricks. Naturally, the difficulty of these challenges will vary, with some coming easily just from playing the game normally, and some requiring a lot of time investment and skill to pull off. In terms of challenge overall, it does definitely feel like the game is a lot more difficult to complete, despite the larger array of tricks and moves at your disposal. The challenges and level objectives will definitely keep you coming back for more, and thankfully the game doesn't baby you around with its difficulty either. It's either get good or don't bother, and I think for a game like this, that's the right mentality to have. There are also various modifiers you can apply to make things somewhat easier, but the downside is that a lot of the challenges get disabled whilst using them, which is fair enough. It's basically like training wheels until you get used to the mechanics. There are plenty of secrets and hidden objectives to be found in each level as well, aside from the general level objectives, such as alien dolls that are hidden throughout the level that once all are acquired unlocks one of the game's new secret characters. There are also Vicarious Visions logo collectibles dotted around each level as well, usually in hard to reach areas that require some skill to reach. The gameplay itself feels just as tight and good to control as it did in the original two games, if not better, with several adjustments and enhancements from future games making a return, such as reverts, acid drops, and other such tricks that make it a lot easier to consistently pull off awesome combos. Admittedly, I'm not the greatest at the game, and some of the more seasoned players might be able to judge the gameplay a little more harshly, but for what it's worth, I think gameplay wise it's definitely the quintessential version of these games, for the amount of different tricks and moves at your disposal alone. Unlike in the original games, your skater's stats can be upgraded by collecting stat points dotted around each level in the game, and you'll definitely want to collect them all if you want your skater to even have a chance against some of the game's hardest challenges. On the topic of skaters, Pro Skater 1 and 2 has quite the large roster of skaters, with all of the previous Pro Skater 1 and 2 pros returning, though aged up to reflect the cold passing of time. There are also a range of new pro skaters to showcase a new generation of talent. They are Iori Nishimura, Leo Baker, Letitia Buffoni, Lizzie Armanto, Nigel Huston, Riley Hawke, Shane O'Neill, and Tyshawn Jones. There are also 3 secret characters, though one of them is only available by purchasing the deluxe edition of the game, that character being the Ripper, a skeleton based on the Powell Peralta brand. The other 2 secret characters are both unlocked by doing various tasks within the game itself. The first is the Roswell alien, obtained from collecting all of the alien pluses scattered throughout each level of the game. The second is the returning series mainstay Officer Dick, this time portrayed and voiced by actor and musician Jack Black, who is unlocked by completing all of the in-game challenges related to your creator skater character. Honestly, the lack of many secret characters is kind of disappointing, for me at least, as the original Pro Skater 2 had Marvel's Spider-Man as an unlockable character, who I admit wouldn't really be a possibility nowadays due to licensing agreements with Disney, but could easily have been replaced with a character from one of Activision's many other properties like Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, or heck, I'd even settle for someone from Call of Duty, since the Tony Hawk series is pretty well known for its awesome unlockable secret characters, like Darth Maul and Wolverine in Pro Skater 3, Iron Man in Tony Hawk Underground, and even Shrek in Tony Hawk Underground 2. It just all feels like a big missed opportunity. In terms of the level designs themselves, all of the levels from Pro Skater 1 and 2 return, brilliantly remade both in terms of graphical fidelity and aesthetical design. All of the levels have been recreated with exact object placement intact, though some have received some interesting overhauls compared to their original designs that really make them stand out a lot better and feel more aesthetically unique than they did in the original. The mall from Pro Skater 1 is a perfect example of this, as it goes from a fairly generic, standard shopping mall in the original game to this overgrown, post-apocalyptical shopping mall that oozes personality, yet because the object placement is the same, it still feels like you're revisiting a familiar location, just worn down by the passage of time. Even the levels that are for the most part relatively aesthetically unchanged, like the beginning warehouse level in Pro Skater 1, feel completely different compared to the original due to the enhanced light and the way light beams it through the windows into the warehouse. Honestly, if there's one thing that you can truly praise the developers for, is that they managed to make each level feel fresh and new, while still retaining everything people loved about those stages. Some of the stages that are based off real world locations such as Marseille are also updated to reflect how those places have changed over the years, which is a neat touch, but depending on preferences you may prefer how the original locations look more. Creator Park is back, this time a lot more developed than it was in Pro Skater 2, with many more items at your disposal, though admittedly it still doesn't feel like there is much variety to the objects or the environments available, and I'm personally not someone who's into these sort of things, so it's not going to get much of mileage from me. I'm quite interested in seeing what other people will be able to create using it though, as I'm sure some people will be able to figure out how to push it to its limits and create some really awesome stuff. The music of Tony Hawk games are vital parts of the game's overall mood and feel, so thankfully the soundtrack of this game is absolutely brilliant, with almost every track from Pro Skater 1 and 2 returning, with a couple new tracks thrown in for good measure, though they are admittedly not as good as the original tracks are, at least for me. In terms of multiplayer modes, Pro Skater 1 and 2 supports both online and local multiplayer across a variety of different modes, including Free Skate, Trick Attack, Score Challenge, Combo Mumbo, Combo Challenge, Graffiti, Horse and Tag. From my experience playing it online, the multiplayer is pretty fun, with all of the modes being fun ways to play the game competitively. In short, for all intents and purposes, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2 really is a faithful adaptation of the original games. A damn sight better than the laughable Pro Skater HD that came before it, at the very least. This remake at least manages to make full use of modern graphical capabilities to the max, to make each of the locations in the game feel fresh and unique, yet still retaining the essence of those levels' theming and design. It very much feels like it's attempting to introduce a new generation to skateboarding, similarly to how the originals all those years back did. The gameplay as well takes full advantage of the series' legacy by introducing mechanics such as reverts that weren't present until later games into those original tracks, adding new potential for really maximising the player's moveset to its full capabilities. All in all, I can say that Pro Skater 1 and 2 more than excels at what it sets out to do, though I do admit I wish it had a couple more secret characters or more substantial unlockables, as the majority of the unlocks do feel kinda wet and unrewarding, but that might just be me. It's a great game despite that though, and I highly recommend it if you're into skateboarding games or skill-based arcade action. Even if you aren't a skateboarding fan, there's a lot of fun to be had with the subtle complexities of chaining combos across a series of interesting and varied environments. So the question is, which version of Pro Skater 1 and 2 is best? Is it the original releases? Pro Skater 2X perhaps? Definitely not Pro Skater HD, I think we established that much. Or did the latest attempt with Pro Skater 1 and 2 surpass its predecessors in every way? Honestly, the answer is a little more complex than just X is better than Y, as each version has unique features and benefits that are missing in other entries. The original releases of Pro Skater 1 and 2 still hold up today regardless of platform, but because of the aging graphics they're a little more than historical showpieces at this point. Moving on to Pro Skater 2X, this version probably has the most meaningful content out of all of them, as it combines both Pro Skater 1 and 2's levels on a better engine and with slightly better visuals and gameplay adjustments, as well as several new levels that all hold up just as well as the original levels. Tony Hawk Pro Skater HD? I want to say it's completely worthless, and in a way it is, because you can no longer purchase it legitimately anymore, but it still has some benefits that differ it from the other games for better or worse. For one, it's the first game in high definition with better graphical assets than the previous versions of the levels. Some of the levels feel quite different to play in this version as well, such as the downhill jam stage, which is set at night unlike every other version of the level. The music selection is almost completely different from other versions as well, which for some is sacrilege and others might prefer it more. Personally, I'm mostly apathetic to that difference though. Basically, if you never played Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD, you really won't miss out on anything meaningful, as everything the game does, other versions of the game, including the original versions, do better, as the gameplay is naff, bugs and glitches are aplenty, and finally it only has a few of the levels from the games to begin with. Which finally brings us to the latest compilation, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2, which for the most part, at least in my opinion, is the definitive versions of these beloved games. First of all, the graphical overhaul is its biggest quality, as the improved lighting, high quality textures and models, as well as the little touches like the drones in Downhill Jam and the better vehicle animations and stages that have them, really help to make these memorable levels feel new again. The retheming of some of the levels, such as the post-apocalyptic rendition of the mall stage and the sunset setting of Venice, helped to make the levels themselves stand out and feel a lot less generic than they did in the original two games, which admittedly might be a turn off for some people, but I absolutely love it. In terms of gameplay, 1 and 2 is also the superior version in that regard, at least in my opinion. It feels like it takes all the best gameplay enhancements from across the entire series and compiles them into one amazingly smooth and solid skateboarding experience. Content-wise, it has pretty much the same amount as 2X, it just exchanges the 2X exclusive levels for challenges and better Creator Skater, Creator Park and multiplayer content. The only real negative I can say about 1 and 2 is that the amount of secret characters in the game is a little underwhelming, but honestly that's probably just a small blemish on what is otherwise a perfect Pro Skater 1 and 2 experience. But yeah, if I were to rank the different versions of Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2 from worst to best, it'd probably go Tony Hawk Pro Skater HD right at the bottom, then the original games, then 2X, and then finally Pro Skater 1 and 2 right at the top, with the only two versions I'd actually want to go back and play every now and then being the latter two games, as they both eclipse the other versions in every single way. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2 in particular has left me very optimistic for the future of the series as a whole, as it's the first good game in about 10 years, and I never even thought we'd ever see a game in the series that matched the quality of the original titles again. I just hope that whatever game comes next for the series, it receives the same care and attention that Pro Skater 1 and 2 did. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to support the channel, and comment below with your thoughts and feelings towards Pro Skater 1 and 2. I'm interested to know what you all think. Until next time guys, this has been Kingdom H, and I'll see you next time.